Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are against our own broken hearts. When you've lost everything that matters, your child's trust, your community's respect, even your own sense of worth, finding hope feels impossible. Marco Silva knew this pain all too well when he inherited a crumbling museum that everyone in town called cursed. They laughed at him for taking on the abandoned building, whispering about the scandal that closed it 20 years ago. But inside those dusty halls, Marco found more than broken exhibits and faded dreams. He discovered an old manifest from 1907 that led to a secret worth 209 million. This isn't just about treasure hidden in forgotten corners. It's about a father learning that sometimes what looks broken on the outside can hold the most precious gifts within. But could rebuilding a museum really help him rebuild his relationship with his son? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty classroom as Marco Silva packed the last of his personal items into a cardboard box. 23 years of teaching history at Greystone High, and it all fit into one worn container: few books, a coffee-stained mug that read, "World's Greatest Dad," a gift from better times, and a small framed photo of David from when he was 8, gap-toothed and grinning after winning his first spelling bee. Marco's fingers lingered on the photograph. That little boy used to run to him after school, backpack bouncing, eager to share every detail of his day. Now, at 15, David barely looked up from his phone during their court-mandated visits every other weekend. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, but the real damage had started long before the papers were signed. "Another budget cut casualty," whispered Janet Morrison, the art teacher, as she paused in his doorway. Her kind eyes held the sympathy of someone who'd watched too many good teachers forced out over the years. "It's not right, Marco. The kids loved your classes." Marco managed a weak smile. 23 years, and they give me 2 weeks' notice. Fiscal responsibility, they called it. He sealed the box with tape that screamed as it unrolled. Maybe it's time for a change anyway. But change was terrifying when you were 47 and felt like you'd failed at everything that mattered. His marriage to Sarah had crumbled under the weight of financial stress and his own stubborn pride. His son barely spoke to him, and now his career, the one thing that had given him purpose, was gone too. The inheritance letter had arrived 3 days after his termination notice, delivered by a lawyer who looked almost apologetic about the timing. Great-uncle Ernesto, whom Marco barely remembered meeting twice in his childhood, had left him the old Greystone City Museum. The same museum that had been boarded up for 20 years, ever since the scandal that rocked their small Pennsylvania town. Marco remembered the headlines from 1984. Museum director vanishes after forgery scandal. Eleanor Whitmore, the respected curator who'd run the museum for 15 years, had disappeared overnight. In her wake, investigators discovered that nearly half the museum's prized collection consisted of clever forgeries. Donors demanded refunds, lawsuits piled up, and the museum's board voted to close permanently rather than face bankruptcy. 20 years later, the building stood like a tombstone on Maple Street, its once pristine marble facade stained by weather and neglect. Teenagers dared each other to touch the front door on Halloween. Local business owners complained that it hurt property values. The city council had voted twice to demolish it, but legal complications with the estate kept it standing, empty and forgotten. "You're not seriously thinking of taking it on, are you?" Sarah had asked when Marco mentioned the inheritance during one of their tense phone conversations about David's schedule. Her voice carried that familiar edge of exasperation that had characterized their final years together. "Marco, that place is cursed. Everyone knows it." But Marco found himself drawn to the building Despitia, perhaps because of its reputation. He'd always been attracted to lost causes, broken things that others had given up on. "It's what made him a good teacher," Sarah used to say, back when she said such things with affection instead of irritation. The first time he used the ornate brass key to unlock the museum's heavy oak doors, the hinges groaned like an old man rising from bed. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that filtered through grimy windows, illuminating what had once been a grand entrance hall. The marble floors, though dulled by decades of neglect, still held traces of their former glory. A magnificent staircase curved upward toward the second floor, its brass railings tarnished but intact. Marco stood in that silence and felt something he hadn't experienced in months' possibility. The museum's layout revealed the ambition of its original designers. The main floor housed what had been the natural history section, with empty display cases that once held fossils and mineral specimens. Faded placards still clung to the walls, their text barely legible after 20 years of moisture and temperature changes. The second floor had been devoted to local history and art, while the basement level contained storage and what appeared to be workshop spaces. Every room told a story of interrupted lives and abandoned dreams. In the curator's office, a 1984 calendar still hung on the wall, frozen on the month of Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance. Coffee cups sat on desks as if their owners had simply stepped out for lunch and never returned. Children's artwork from a school group's final visit remained pinned to a bulletin board, the bright colors now faded to pastels. But it was in sorting through a pile of administrative papers that Marco made his first significant discovery. Hidden among insurance forms and supplier invoices, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, was a brass key, unlike any of the others he'd been given. This one was larger, more ornate, with the museum's original crest etched into its surfacer tree of knowledge, with roots spreading deep into the earth. The key felt warm in his palm, substantial in a way that suggested importance. But importance for what? None of the locks he'd tried responded to it. Marco tucked it into his pocket anyway, some instinct telling him to keep it close. Over the following weeks, he established a routine. Mornings were spent at the unemployment office or sending out resumes to school districts that weren't hiring. Afternoons belonged to the museum. He swept floors, wiped down surfaces, and began cataloguing what had been left behind. The work was therapeutic in a way he hadn't expected. Each cleaned window let in a little more light. Each organized room revealed a little more of the building's original character. The townspeople's reactions ranged from puzzled to openly mocking. Harold Brennan, who owned the hardware store across the street, made a point of shaking his head whenever he saw Marco entering the building. Throwing good money after bad, he'd mutter to anyone who'd listen. That place has been nothing but trouble since day one. Mrs. Henderson from the corner grocery store was more direct. You know, Eleanor Whitmore went crazy in there, don't you? She informed Marco one afternoon as he purchased cleaning supplies. They say she started talking to the exhibits, claimed the artifacts were speaking to her. Mark my words, that building does something to people. But not everyone shared the town's superstitions. Dr. Margaret Chen, who ran the small historical society from her home, stopped by one afternoon with a plate of cookies and genuine curiosity about Marco's plans. I was Eleanor's friend, she said, settling into one of the 2 chairs Marco had salvaged and repaired in the curator's office. We corresponded regularly about research projects. She was brilliant, you know. Whatever happened at the end, it wasn't because she'd lost her mind. Dr. Chen had silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She'd been a professor of archaeology at Penn State before retiring to Greystone, and her knowledge of the museum's history proved invaluable. Eleanor came here in 1969, fresh out of graduate school with big dreams about making history accessible to everyone, Dr. Chen explained. She transformed this place from a dusty collection of local oddities into something genuinely impressive: traveling exhibits, educational programs, partnerships with major museums in Philadelphia and New York. The forgery scandal never made sense to me. What do you think really happened? Marco asked. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. I think Eleanor discovered something she wasn't supposed to discover, and I think she paid a price for it. The conversation lingered in Marco's mind as he continued his work. He began paying closer attention to the details. Others might miss scratches on walls that could indicate hidden panels, spaces between rooms that seemed too large, floorboards that sounded different when stepped on. It was during one of these careful examinations that he noticed the loose brick behind Eleanor's desk. It protruded just slightly, as if someone had removed it recently and hadn't quite seated it properly when replacing it. When Marco worked it free, his fingers encountered not an empty space, but something wrapped in oilcloth. His heart pounded as he carefully extracted the package. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age but still clearly legible. The title page read, "Acquisition Manifest, 1907, in careful copperplate handwriting. Below that, in a different hand, someone had written, "For the next Guardian, E.W." Marco sank into Eleanor's chair, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the manifest. Page after page detailed acquisitions made in the museum's early years, artifacts, specimens, artwork, and curiosities from around the world. But it was the final section that made his breath catch. Special collection, restricted access, headed a list of items that read like something from an adventure novel. Ancient pottery from newly discovered archaeological sites. Rare manuscripts thought lost to history. Gemstones and jewelry pieces described with the kind of detail that suggested enormous value. And at the bottom of the list, in red ink, total estimated value, 2024 adjustment. Someone, presumably Eleanor, had updated the financial estimates to reflect modern valuations. But where were these treasures now? The museum's remaining collection consisted mainly of broken display pieces and local historical artifacts of modest value. Had the special collection been sold off to cover debts? Lost in the scandal? Or was it possible, just possible, that Eleanor had hidden it somewhere? Marco's hands shook as he turned to the final page of the manifest. There, in Eleanor's careful script, was a message that changed everything. To whoever finds this record, the collection described herein remains intact and secure. I have preserved it as a trust for future generations, as was always intended. The map to its location lies in the things they called forgeries. What appears false may be more true than anyone imagined. Trust in the compass of conscience, and remember that the greatest treasures are not always made of gold. E.W., Guardian Emeritus. Marco read the message 3 times before its implications fully sank in. Eleanor hadn't been a criminal who'd defrauded the museum. She'd been a protector who'd hidden something valuable to keep it safe. But safe from what? And why the elaborate deception? As evening shadows lengthened across the curator's office, Marco carefully rewrapped the manifest and returned it to its hiding place. His mind raced with possibilities and questions. Tomorrow, he would begin the real work, not just of cleaning and organizing, but of solving a 20-year-old mystery. For the first time since his divorce, since losing his job, since watching his relationship with David crumble, Marco Silva felt something like hope stirring in his chest. He had a purpose again, a puzzle that needed solving, a trust that needed honoring. He locked the museum doors behind him and walked home through the quiet streets of Greystone, the brass key warm in his pocket and Eleanor's words echoing in his mind. The greatest treasures are not always made of gold. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the real treasure wasn't the 209 million collection at all, but the chance to prove himself worthy of something important again. The chance to show David and himself that broken things could still hold value. The moon was rising over Greystone as Marco climbed the steps to his small apartment, already planning tomorrow's return to the museum. Somewhere in that building lay the answers to questions that had haunted the town for 20 years. And maybe, just maybe, those answers would help him find his way back to the person he used to be, Father David had once been proud to call his own. The following Monday brought the kind of rain that seemed to seep into your bones and settle there. Marco stood at the museum's entrance, fumbling with the brass key while water dripped from his jacket collar. The building looked even more forlorn in the grey morning light, its marble steps slick and treacherous. Inside, the silence felt different, somehow expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Marco had spent the weekend researching Eleanor Whitmore, poring over old newspaper articles and city records. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that the official story of her disappearance didn't add up. Eleanor had been meticulous, organized, passionate about preserving history for future generations. Her published papers showed a brilliant mind with an almost obsessive attention to detail. This wasn't someone who would suddenly begin replacing valuable artifacts with forgeries, no matter what financial pressures the museum faced. Marco began his work in the basement storage area, methodically sorting through crates that had been hastily packed during the museum's closure. Most contained exactly what their labels indicated: broken pottery shards, outdated educational materials, cleaning supplies that had long since dried out. But it was while moving a particularly heavy crate marked miscellaneous administrative that he heard something shift inside. Setting the crate on a workbench, Marco pried off the lid. Beneath layers of yellowed newspaper from 1984 lay a collection of items that seemed oddly personal for administrative storage: a woman's reading glasses, a small jade figurine, a leather appointment book, and at the bottom, wrapped in what had once been a silk scarf, a leather-bound journal. The journal's cover bore the initials EW in faded gold lettering. Marco's pulse quickened as he opened to the first page. Personal Journal of Eleanor Whitmore, Curator, Greystone City Museum, January 1, 1984. The early entries revealed Eleanor's growing concerns about pressure from the museum's board of directors to sell certain pieces from the collection. Names appeared repeatedly: Harrison Webb, the board chairman who owned the largest construction company in town; Mrs. Victoria Ashford, whose late husband had been one of the museum's founding donors; and Dr. Richard Pemberton, a local physician who'd served on the board for over a decade. Harrison suggested again today that we streamline the collection, Eleanor had written in March. He claims declining attendance requires us to liquidate some of the less popular exhibits. But the pieces he's identified aren't less popular. They're among our most valuable. Something isn't right about his sudden interest in museum finances. As Marco read deeper into the journal, a pattern emerged. The board members were pressuring Eleanor to sell specific artifacts, always claiming financial necessity, but their proposed buyers seemed to offer suspiciously low prices for items Eleanor knew to be worth far more. An entry from June caught his attention. "I've made a terrible discovery. The buyer, Dr. Pemberton recommended for the Ming Dynasty vase, isn't a museum or legitimate collector. He's a private dealer who specializes in selling artifacts to overseas collectors with questionable provenance requirements. They're not trying to save the museum, they're trying to profit from it." Marco sat back in the dusty basement, pieces of a 20-year-old puzzle beginning to fall into place. Eleanor hadn't been stealing from the museum, she'd been trying to protect it from thieves who happened to serve on its board of directors. The final entries in the journal, dated just weeks before Eleanor's disappearance, revealed her desperate plan. "I've created detailed replicas of the most valuable pieces. If I can substitute them temporarily, I can move the originals to a secure location until I can expose what Harrison and the others are planning. It's risky, but I can't stand by and watch them loot our collection." The last entry was dated August 15, 1984, 2 days before Eleanor vanished. "The board has called an emergency meeting for Friday. Harrison claims they've discovered irregularities in the collection. I think they know what I've done. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find this journal and understand that I only wanted to preserve what we've worked so hard to build. The real collection is safe. I've hidden it where those who truly understand its value will eventually find it. Look for the compass that points not north, but toward truth." Marco's hands trembled as he closed the journal. Eleanor hadn't disappeared in disgrace as she'd been driven away by corrupt board members who'd discovered her efforts to thwart their scheme. But what had happened to the real artifacts she'd hidden? And what did she mean about a compass? The sound of footsteps on the floor above interrupted his thoughts. Marco quickly rewrapped the journal and placed it back in the crate, his heart racing. He'd told no one about his discovery of the manifest, wanting to understand more before involving others. "Marco? You down there?" Dr. Chen's voice echoed down the stairwell. "Coming up," Marco called, relief flooding through him. He climbed the stairs to find Dr. Chen examining one of the empty display cases in the main hall, her expression thoughtful. "I brought you something," she said, producing a manila folder from her bag. "Copies of correspondence between Eleanor and various museums around the country. I thought you might find them interesting." Marco accepted the folder gratefully, though his mind was still reeling from what he'd just read. "Dr. Chen, in your opinion, was Eleanor the type of person who would steal from the museum?" The older woman's laugh was sharp and immediate. "Absolutely not. Eleanor would have given her life to protect that collection. In fact, I think she might have done exactly that." Her expression grew serious. "Why do you ask?" Marco hesitated, then decided to trust her. "I found something. Eleanor's journal. It suggests the forgery scandal wasn't what it appeared to be." Dr. Chen's eyes widened. "Show me." Back in the basement, Marco carefully extracted the journal and shared Eleanor's final entries. Dr. Chen read in silence, her expression growing increasingly grim. "This makes perfect sense," she said finally. "Harrison Webb bought a mansion in Florida just months after the museum closed. Dr. Pemberton suddenly had money to expand his practice, and Mrs. Ashford's charitable donations to other institutions increased dramatically around the same time. But if Eleanor hid the real artifacts, where are they now?" Dr. Chen pointed to the journal's final entry. She mentions a compass. Eleanor was fascinated by navigation instruments. She had a small collection of antique compasses in her office. "If she left clues, that's where I'd start looking." They made their way to Eleanor's former office, a corner room on the second floor with tall windows that had once offered a view of the town square. The space had been stripped bare when the museum closed, but Marco had been slowly cleaning and organizing it as a base for his restoration efforts. "There," Dr. Chen said, pointing to a built-in bookshelf along one wall. "Eleanor's desk used to sit right there, and she kept her compass collection on the shelf behind it." Marco examined the bookshelf more carefully. Most of the shelves were obviously original construction, but one section near the bottom looked different. The wood was slightly newer, the finish not quite matching the rest. Working together, they discovered that the mismatched section wasn't actually attached to the main bookshelf. It slid out to reveal a hidden compartment, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single Victorian-era compass. The compass was beautiful brass and silver, with intricate engravings around its face. But when Marco held it flat, the needle didn't point north. Instead, it swung toward the east wall of the office, seemingly magnetized by something in that direction. "It's been modified," Dr. Chen observed, examining the compass more closely. "This isn't responding to magnetic north. Something else is drawing the needle." Marco followed the compass's direction, walking slowly along the east wall until the needle pointed directly downward. They were standing in front of what appeared to be a solid section of wall, but when Marco pressed against it, the panel gave slightly. Hidden behind the false wall was a small chamber, clearly added during Eleanor's tenure. Inside was a metal filing cabinet, and in the cabinet's top drawer was a rolled piece of paper tied with a faded ribbon. The paper turned out to be a hand-drawn map of the museum and its surrounding grounds, marked with coordinates and symbols that meant nothing to Marco, but seemed to fascinate Dr. Chen. "These are surveyor's marks," she explained, tracing the symbols with her finger. "Eleanor must have had the property professionally mapped. And look," she pointed to several X marks scattered across the map. "These could indicate burial sites." "Burial sites? Not graves," Dr. Chen clarified quickly. "Cache locations, places where valuable items might be buried for safekeeping." The largest X was located in what appeared to be the museum's basement, in an area Marco hadn't yet fully explored. Smaller marks dotted the grounds outside, including one beneath what the map labeled as the oak tree. Marco knew the tree, a massive white oak that dominated the museum's front lawn, its trunk so large that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around it. Local legend claimed it was over 200 years old, planted when the first settlers arrived in the area. "We need to start with the basement location," Dr. Chen said practically. "If Eleanor hid something there, it's been protected from weather and casual discovery." They made their way back downstairs, using the map's coordinates to locate the precise spot Eleanor had marked. It was in the farthest corner of the basement, behind a section of storage shelving that Marco hadn't yet moved. When they shifted the shelving aside, they found what looked like ordinary concrete flooring. But the compass needle spun wildly when held over one particular section, and a closer examination revealed that the concrete in that area was slightly different in color and texture. "This section was poured more recently than the rest," Dr. Chen observed, "probably sometime in the 1980s. Marco felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. If they were right, if Eleanor had actually buried part of the museum's collection beneath this floor, then everything about the scandal would need to be reconsidered. The town's assumptions about Eleanor's guilt, the museum's closure, even his own presence here would all take on new meaning. But excavating the floor would require tools they didn't have, and probably permits they couldn't get. More importantly, it would mean committing fully to Eleanor's mystery, accepting that his quiet restoration project had become something much more significant and potentially dangerous. As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Chen placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This doesn't have to be your responsibility, Marco. We could contact the authorities, let them handle the investigation." Marco thought about that possibility, turning over Eleanor's journal and map to police who might or might not take them seriously, watching from the sidelines as others decided the fate of discoveries he'd made, returning to his small apartment and his job search and his failed relationship with David. "No," he said quietly. "Eleanor trusted this place to the right person. She wrote that message for whoever came after her. I think she meant it for me." Dr. Chen smiled. "Then we'll need to be very careful about how we proceed, and we'll need help." That evening, Marco sat in his apartment, staring at his phone. Eleanor's journal open on his kitchen table. In 3 days, David would come for his regular weekend visit. They usually spent the time in awkward silence, David absorbed in his phone, while Marco struggled to find topics that might interest a 15-year-old who barely tolerated his presence. But this time could be different. David had always loved puzzles and mysteries, had inherited Marco's appreciation for history, despite his current indifference to nearly everything his father said or did. Maybe, just maybe, the mystery of Eleanor Whitmore and the hidden treasure could give them something to share. Marco picked up his phone and dialed his son's number. "Dad?" David's voice held its usual note of mild irritation at being contacted outside their scheduled visits. "Hey, buddy. I know this is last minute, but I was wondering if you'd like to come to the museum with me this weekend. I've found something you might find interesting." There was a long pause. "The creepy old museum. Dad, that place gives everyone the creeps." "I know it seems that way, but I've discovered some things that might change your mind. It's like a real-life treasure hunt." Another pause, shorter this time. "What kind of treasure hunt?" Marco smiled, hearing the first hint of genuine curiosity in his son's voice that he'd heard in months. "The kind where we might actually find treasure." David arrived Saturday morning with his usual armor of adolescent skepticism, but Marco caught him glancing around the museum's entrance hall with something approaching interest. The building did look different, now cleaner, more welcoming. With afternoon sunlight streaming through windows Marco had spent hours washing. "So this is where the crazy lady lived," David said, his voice carrying that particular tone teenagers used when they wanted to sound bored, but weren't quite managing it. "Eleanor Whitmore wasn't crazy," Marco replied gently. "That's actually what I wanted to show you." He led David to Eleanor's former office, now functioning as Marco's research center, The walls were covered with photocopied newspaper articles, timelines, and photographs of the museum in its heyday. David's eyes moved across the display with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for video games. "She really disappeared overnight?" David asked, studying a yellowed newspaper clipping. "August 17th, 1984, but I don't think she ran away because she was guilty of anything." Marco opened Eleanor's journal to a page he'd marked. "Read this." David read silently, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed Eleanor's words about the corrupt board members. When he finished, he looked up at his father with genuine surprise. She was trying to protect the museum's collection from being stolen by the people who were supposed to be protecting it. "That's what I think happened, and I believe she succeeded, at least partially." Marco showed David the compass and explained how they'd found the hidden chamber. "This is like something from a movie," David said, examining the compass with the careful attention he'd once given to his favorite toys. "The needle really doesn't point north. See for yourself." David held the compass level, watching the needle swing toward the east wall. "That's actually pretty cool. So you think there's really treasure buried here?" "I think Eleanor hid valuable artifacts to keep them safe. Whether that qualifies as treasure depends on your perspective." Marco paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was hoping you might want to help me figure out where she put them." For the first time in months, David smiled at his father, not the polite, dutiful smile he produced for special occasions, but a genuine expression of interest and excitement. "You're serious? You actually want my help with this?" "I can't think of anyone I'd rather have as a partner," Marco said, and meant it completely. They spent the morning examining Eleanor's map more carefully, with David applying the kind of systematic thinking that made him excel at school, despite his apparent disinterest in most subjects. He photographed the map with his phone and used an app to overlay it onto a current satellite image of the museum property. "Look at this," he said, showing Marco the screen. "The basement cache location lines up perfectly with that corner where you moved the shelving. And this mark here," he pointed to an X on the lawn. "It's not under the oak tree like you thought. It's about 10 feet southeast of it." Marco studied the overlay, impressed by his son's technical approach. "You're right. I was reading the scale wrong. The other marks are interesting too. This one's in what looks like the garden area behind the building, and this one," David traced a symbol with his finger. "This one's actually inside the building, but not in the basement. Maybe the first floor." They made their way to the location David had identified, a corner of the main exhibition hall where Marco had stacked boxes of cleaning supplies. Moving the boxes revealed nothing unusual about the floor, but when David held the compass at shoulder height, the needle began pointing downward again. "It's not in the floor," David said with growing excitement. "It's in the wall." A careful examination of the wall revealed what appeared to be a slightly different texture in one section, as if the plaster had been patched and repainted. When Marco pressed against it, the section gave slightly, just as the panel in Eleanor's office had done. Behind the false wall was another small chamber, and inside it was a wooden crate marked with Eleanor's initials. Marco's hands shook slightly as he pried open the lid. Inside, nested in layers of protective cloth, were 3 artifacts that took his breath away. A jade figurine of exquisite craftsmanship, clearly ancient and Asian in origin. A small but ornate golden chalice that looked European, possibly medieval. And most striking of all, a Native American pottery vessel decorated with intricate, geometric patterns that seemed to tell a story in themselves. "Dad," David whispered, his voice filled with awe, "these look really old, really valuable." Marco lifted the pottery vessel carefully, noting its perfect condition despite what had to be considerable age. A small card tucked beneath it bore Eleanor's handwriting, "Hopi ceremonial vessel, circa 1200 CE by, donated by Smithsonian XS, 1971. Estimated value, 850, 0. The jade figurine's card read, "Han Dynasty horse, 206 BCE, 220 CE. Private donation, 1,978. Estimated value, 1.2 million. The chalice's documentation was even more startling. Medieval communion cup, 14th century, possibly from dissolved monastery. Provenance uncertain but authenticated. Estimated value, 2.8 million. David did quick math on his phone. Dad, that's almost $5 million just in this one hiding spot. Marco felt dizzy. Eleanor's manifest had mentioned 209 million in total. But seeing actual artifacts, touching them, holding them made the reality of her achievement suddenly concrete. She had actually done it. She had saved priceless pieces of history from corrupt board members who would have sold them to the highest bidder. "We need to document everything," Marco said, his teacher's instincts kicking in. Photographs, measurements, condition reports. If these artifacts have been hidden for 20 years, we need to prove their authenticity and provenance. They spent the next 2 hours carefully documenting their find, with David proving surprisingly adept at photography and note-taking. His initial excitement had settled into focused concentration, and Marco found himself remembering why he'd fallen in love with history in the first place, that moment when the past became tangible, when stories stopped being abstract and became real. "You know what's weird?" David said as they carefully rewrapped the artifacts. "The town thinks this place is cursed, but finding these things, it doesn't feel cursed at all. It feels like we're supposed to be here." Marco looked at his son, seeing not the sullen teenager who'd gotten out of Sarah's car that morning, but the curious, engaged boy he remembered from before. Everything started falling apart. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. "Eleanor wrote that she hid the collection for the next guardian. Maybe she meant whoever would care enough to look for the truth." As they prepared to leave for lunch, David paused at the museum's front entrance. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you really take this place on? I mean, everyone thinks it's a waste of time, and you could have just sold it or something." Marco considered the question seriously. "I guess I saw something in it that reminded me of myself, something that looked broken from the outside, but might still have value if someone took the time to look deeper." David nodded slowly. "Like how you always told me that old books might look boring, but they contained all these amazing stories if you knew how to find them." "Exactly like that. And finding Eleanor's stuff, that's like finding the good stories that everyone thought were lost." Marco felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Yes, but David, the real treasure isn't the artifacts. It's getting to share this with you. It's having something important we can work on together." For a moment, the careful distance David had maintained for months seemed to dissolve. "I missed this," he said quietly. "I missed talking to you about stuff that matters." "I missed it too, buddy. More than you know." They drove to lunch in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the morning's discoveries. But as they sat across from each other at the small diner on Main Street, Marco noticed that David wasn't checking his phone every few minutes. Instead, he was sketching the layout of the museum on a napkin, marking the locations where they'd found artifacts and noting where Eleanor's map indicated other potential hiding spots. "So what's our next move?" David asked between bites of his sandwich. "Our next move? Come on, Dad. You don't think I'm just going to help you find one cache and then lose interest, do you? We've got a mystery to solve." "And besides," he grinned, and Marco's heart nearly stopped at how much that smile looked like the little boy who used to greet him after school. "I want to know what else Eleanor hid. This is the coolest thing that's ever happened in this boring town." Marco reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "Our next move is to research Eleanor's background more thoroughly. If we're going to find the rest of her collection, we need to understand how she thought, what was important to her, how she made decisions. Like criminal profiling, but for someone who was actually trying to do good?" "Exactly." David pulled out his phone, but this time it was to show Marco something he'd been researching. "I looked up that compass while you were paying for lunch. That style of modification was used by surveyors in the 19th century to mark specific locations for future reference. If Eleanor knew about that technique, then she might have used it to create a trail," Marco finished. The compass doesn't just point to one location, it points to the first location in a sequence. Which means the artifacts we found today were meant to be found first. They're the beginning of the treasure hunt, not the end. As they drove back to the museum, Marco felt something he'd almost forgotten was possible: genuine excitement about the future. For months, his life had felt like a series of things being taken away from him. His job, his marriage, his relationship with David, his sense of purpose and self-worth. But Eleanor Whitmore's legacy was giving him something precious in return. A mystery worth solving, a cause worth fighting for, and most importantly, a chance to rebuild the connection with his son that he'd feared was lost forever. The museum stood before them in the afternoon sunlight, no longer looking like a monument to failure and scandal. Instead, it looked like what Eleanor had always intended it to be: a place where the past came alive, where stories waited to be discovered, where wonder could flourish if given the proper care and attention. "Ready to get back to work?" Marco asked as they climbed the front steps. "Ready," David said, and Marco heard in his voice not just enthusiasm for the treasure hunt, but something deeper: respect, trust, and maybe even pride in what his father was trying to accomplish. For the first time since his world had started falling apart, Marco Silva felt like he might actually be succeeding at something that mattered. The following week brought a change in the town's attitude toward Marco that was subtle but unmistakable. Word had somehow spread that he'd found something interesting in the museum, though he and David had been careful not to reveal specifics. Dr. Chen, he suspected, had shared just enough information to generate curiosity without compromising their investigation. Harold Brennan from the hardware store actually nodded when Marco passed his shop, and Mrs. Henderson asked pointed questions about his restoration project when he bought groceries. Even more surprising, the Greystone Gazette ran a small article about the museum's potential revival, complete with a photo of Marco standing in the main exhibition hall. Local educator Marco Silva has undertaken the ambitious project of restoring the long-closed Greystone City Museum, the article read. Silva, who inherited the building from his great-uncle, believes the museum could once again serve as an educational resource for the community. "There's a lot of history here that deserves to be preserved," Silva told this reporter. David had been staying for longer visits, officially to help with research. But Marco knew his son was as captivated by the mystery as he was. They'd established a routine: afternoons exploring the museum, evenings researching Eleanor's background and the artifacts they'd discovered. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday when David was examining the compass more closely under a magnifying glass Marco had borrowed from Dr. Chen. "Dad, look at this," David said, his voice tight with excitement. "There are tiny markings around the edge of the compass face. I thought they were just decorative, but they're actually numbers." Marco peered through the magnifying glass. David was right-etched in delicate script around the compass's perimeter were a series of numbers that could easily be mistaken for ornamental flourishes. "Coordinates," Marco suggested. "Maybe, but not latitude and longitude. The numbers are too small." David photographed the compass face with his phone's macro lens, then enlarged the image on the screen. "Wait, look at this sequence. 3, 7, 12, 1, 5, 14, 15, 18. Marco stared at the numbers, something familiar nagging at his memory. "Those aren't coordinates. They're letters," David finished. "If A equals 1, B equals 2, and so on. 3, 7, 12, 1, 5, 14, 15, 18 spells out CGLAENOR. Eleanor backwards," Marco said softly. "And if we reverse the sequence, RONAELGC, which doesn't spell anything obvious." David frowned at his phone screen. "Unless it's not meant to be read as one word." They spent the next hour trying different combinations before David had another insight. What if the letters don't spell words? What if they refer to something else in the museum? Marco thought about that. Eleanor was a curator. She would have used systematic classification for everything. letters and numbers usually mean. Catalogue numbers, David said, like library books or museum pieces. They hurried to Eleanor's office, where Marco had been organizing the surviving administrative records. Buried in a file cabinet, they found Eleanor's master catalogue thick binder, containing detailed records of every item in the museum's collection, each assigned a unique alphanumeric code. CG12, Marco read from the compass. That would be Exhibit Case C, Shelf G, Item 12. He flipped through the catalogue pages. Here it is. Native American arrowhead, origin unknown, donated 1,979. David was already heading for the main exhibition hall. Case C was in the natural history section, right? The display case was still there, though empty and covered with dust. But when David examined it closely, he found that the back panel was slightly loose. Behind it was a hidden compartment containing a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch was another piece of the puzzly Silva locket that opened to reveal not a photograph, but a tiny piece of paper with more coordinates written in Eleanor's careful script. She really thought of everything, David said admiringly. It's like she designed the whole thing as a treasure hunt. The coordinates led them to the museum's garden area, where a neglected flower bed had been slowly returning to nature. Using a borrowed metal detector from Dr. Chen, they located a buried metal box about 3 feet below the surface. This cache was larger than the first, containing 6 artifacts that made David whistle softly. A small bronze statue that looked Greek or Roman, 2 pieces of ancient pottery with intricate painted designs, a collection of rare coins in protective cases, a jade bracelet that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, and most remarkably, a leather-bound manuscript written in what appeared to be Latin. The documentation Eleanor had included with these pieces was even more detailed than before, including not just provenance and value estimates, but historical context that revealed her deep knowledge of each artifact's significance. This bronze is a Roman household god from the 12th century, Marco read from Eleanor's notes. The pottery is Minoan, possibly 30 years old. And this manuscript, he paused, his voice filled with awe. This is a medieval copy of Aristotle's lost work on comedy. Scholars have been looking for this for centuries. David was running calculations on his phone again. Dad, this cache is worth even more than the first one. We're talking about maybe $15 or $20 million just between these 2 hiding spots. But as they carefully documented and repackaged the artifacts, Marco felt a growing sense of unease. These weren't just valuable objects, they were pieces of human history that belonged in institutions where scholars could study them and the public could appreciate them. Keeping them hidden, even temporarily, felt wrong. We need to start thinking about what comes next, he told David as they secured the artifacts in a safe deposit box at the local bank. These pieces shouldn't be locked away. Eleanor saved them for a reason, but not so they could stay hidden forever. What about the rest of the collection? Eleanor's manifest mentioned 209 million total. We found maybe 25 million so far. Marco had been thinking about that too. I think the remaining artifacts are in the basement location, the one that would require excavating the concrete floor. So we dig it up? It's not that simple. Excavating inside a historic building requires permits, probably archaeological supervision, definitely legal documentation. And once we start that process, we lose control of what happens next. David was quiet for a moment, understanding the dilemma. But if we don't excavate, the artifacts stay buried forever. That's not what Eleanor wanted either. They were walking home from the bank when David's phone buzzed with a text message. His expression changed as he read it, and he showed Marco the screen. Mom wants to know why you're keeping me so late. She says I'm supposed to be back by 6 on school nights. Marco checked his watch 7:30. They'd been so absorbed in their discovery that he'd lost track of time completely. I'll call her and explain, Marco said, but David shook his head. She won't understand. Mom thinks this whole museum thing is just another one of your impractical projects that takes time away from finding a real job. There was no criticism in David's voice, just the weary recognition of family dynamics that had become all too familiar. Sarah had never shared Marco's enthusiasm for history, had always seen his passion for teaching as a character flaw rather than a calling. Maybe we should tell her what we found, Marco suggested. When she realizes the value of Eleanor's collection. Dad. David's voice was gentle but firm. Mom's not going to care about the historical significance or the mystery or any of that. She's going to see dollar signs and want to call lawyers and turn the whole thing into a circus. Marco knew his son was right. Sarah's practical nature, which had once balanced his own tendency toward idealism, had become something harder during their divorce. Everything was now viewed through the lens of financial security and social respectability. So what do you think we should do? David considered this seriously. I think we keep investigating until we understand the whole story. Then we figure out how to honor what Eleanor was trying to do, while also making sure the artifacts end up where they belong. That could take weeks, or even months. Good, David said with a smile that reminded Marco of the determined little boy who'd once spent entire afternoons building elaborate Lego cities. I'm not ready for this to end yet, are you? Marco looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw something he'd been afraid he'd lost forever. David was engaged, excited, proud of what they were accomplishing together. For the first time in months, they were functioning as a team, working toward a common goal that mattered to both of them. No, Marco said. I'm not ready for it to end either. As they reached Marco's apartment building, David paused on the front steps. Dad, can I ask you something personal? Always. Do you think we would have figured this out if everything hadn't fallen apart? I mean, if you were still teaching, and Mum wasn't. He struggled to find the right words. If our family was still normal? Marco thought about that question seriously. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I was too comfortable before, too willing to accept things as they were instead of looking deeper. Eleanor's compass, David said thoughtfully. It doesn't point to where you expect it to point. Maybe that's the whole lesson. What do you mean? Maybe the most important discoveries happen when you stop following the obvious path and start paying attention to what everyone else is ignoring. As Marco watched his son walk to Sarah's car, which had just pulled up to the curb, he reflected on the wisdom in those words. 6 months ago, he'd been following all the conventional path, steady job, regular schedule, predictable life. And he'd been miserable, watching his relationships crumble and his sense of purpose slowly drain away. Now he was unemployed, living in a tiny apartment, and spending his days in a building most people considered cursed. But he was also discovering treasures, solving mysteries, and rebuilding the most important relationship in his life. Maybe David was right. Maybe the compass of life didn't always point where you expected it to. Maybe sometimes it pointed toward exactly where you needed to go, even if that direction looked impossible from the outside. Standing in the evening shadows of Greystone's quiet streets, Marco felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the wealth they'd discovered, but for the journey that had led him here. Eleanor Whitmore had saved more than just artifacts from destruction. She'd created a path for someone like him to find his way back to what mattered most. The question now was whether he could follow that path all the way to its conclusion, and whether the conclusion would be worth the risks they'd have to take. 3 weeks into their investigation, Marco received a phone call that changed everything. He was in the museum's basement, carefully measuring the concrete section that Eleanor's map indicated as the major cache location, when his phone rang. Mr. Silva, this is Detective Patricia Reynolds with the Greystone Police Department. I understand you've been doing some restoration work at the old museum. Marco's blood ran cold. Had someone reported their excavations? Were they in legal trouble for the artifacts they'd already found? Yes, that's correct, he said carefully. I wonder if you might have time to meet this afternoon. There's been some renewed interest in the Eleanor Whitmore case, and we'd appreciate any insights you might have gained about the building or its history. An hour later, Marco sat across from Detective Reynolds in a small conference room at the police station. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of direct manner that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The Whitmore case has been officially closed for 20 years, she began, "but I've been reviewing old files as part of a department initiative to digitize records. Some things about her disappearance never sat right with me." Marco tried to keep his expression neutral. "What kinds of things?" "Well, for starters, Eleanor Whitmore was reported missing by her landlord, not by anyone from the museum. The board of directors didn't even file a report until 3 days after she'd supposedly vanished. That seems odd for someone in a position of responsibility. Maybe they thought she was taking a few days off?" Detective Reynolds consulted her notes. According to the original investigation, Dr. Pemberton claimed Eleanor had been acting erratically for weeks before her disappearance. But when we interviewed other museum staff, they said she seemed perfectly normal, just concerned about some board decisions she disagreed with. Marco felt his pulse quicken. "What kinds of decisions?" "That's where it gets interesting. The board had been pushing to sell certain pieces from the collection, claiming financial difficulties. But the museum's books showed they were actually in good shape financially. The pressure to sell seemed to come from outside sources." Detective Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Silva, in your work at the museum, have you found any documents that might shed light on Eleanor's state of mind during those final weeks?" Marco faced a moment of truth. He could lie, claim he'd found nothing significant, and continue their investigation in secret. Or he could trust Detective Reynolds with at least part of what they'd discovered. "I found her personal journal," he said finally, "hidden in a storage crate in the basement." Detective Reynolds's eyebrows rose. "May I see it?" "I'll bring it to you tomorrow. But Detective, the journal suggests Eleanor wasn't guilty of fraud. It suggests she was trying to protect the museum's collection from people who wanted to steal it." "People like who?" "Board members, people in positions of trust who were using their authority to line their own pockets." Detective Reynolds made notes as Marco explained what Eleanor's journal revealed about the pressure to sell artifacts and the suspicious buyers being recommended by board members. "This aligns with some things that bothered me about the original investigation," she said. "Harrison Webb, for instance. He bought a very expensive property in Florida just months after the museum closed. When asked about it during the original investigation, he claimed it was from a successful construction contract, but we could never find records of any project large enough to generate that kind of income." "What about Dr. Pemberton?" "Similar story. Sudden, unexplained wealth right around the time of Eleanor's disappearance. But by the time anyone thought to ask serious questions, the case had been closed and everyone had moved on." Marco hesitated, then decided to share more. "Detective, what would happen if someone found artifacts that might have belonged to the museum's original collection? Legally, if they were legitimately acquired by the museum and properly documented, they'd probably be considered part of your inheritance. But if they were involved in the original fraud case..." She paused. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the legal implications." Detective Reynolds studied him carefully. "Mr. Silva, if you found something significant, you should know that the statute of limitations on fraud charges expired years ago. No one's going to face criminal charges for what happened in 1984. But that doesn't mean the truth isn't worth discovering." That evening, Marco met with David and Dr. Chen at the museum to discuss the police interview. Dr. Chen was particularly intrigued by Detective Reynolds's interest in the case. "Pat Reynolds is good people," she said. "She's not looking to create problems. She genuinely wants to understand what happened to Eleanor. I think we can trust her." "But if we tell her about the artifacts, won't that mean turning everything over to the authorities?" David asked. "Not necessarily," Dr. Chen replied. "If the artifacts were legitimately acquired by the museum, and if Eleanor hid them to protect them from theft, then they're probably legally yours, Marco. The police would want to verify their authenticity and provenance, but that's something we should be doing anyway." They were discussing their options when David made a discovery that changed the entire conversation. He'd been examining the forged Egyptian scarab that had been part of the scandalone of the fake artifacts that had triggered the investigation into Eleanor's activities. "Dad, look at this," David said, holding the scarab under a bright light. "This isn't a forgery." "What do you mean?" "I mean, this scarab is real, ancient, maybe 3,000 years old." David showed them what he'd noticed. Tiny hieroglyphs etched into the scarab's surface, so small they were nearly invisible to the naked eye. "I researched the symbols online. They're authentic hieroglyphs spelling out a pharaoh's name." Marco felt the ground shift beneath his understanding. But this was identified as one of the forgeries that proved Eleanor's guilt. "Which means someone deliberately mislabeled it," Dr. Chen said slowly. "Someone wanted authentic artifacts to be classified as fakes." The implications hit them all at once. If the forgeries were actually real artifacts, then Eleanor hadn't been replacing authentic pieces with fakes. She'd been hiding authentic pieces and allowing them to be mislabeled as forgeries to protect them from theft. "It's brilliant," David said with admiration. "No one steals artifacts that are supposedly worthless fakes." By letting the board think she'd replaced valuable pieces with forgeries, Eleanor ensured the real artifacts would be safe. But how many pieces were mislabeled? Marco wondered. They spent the next 2 hours examining every artifact in the museum's remaining collection, the pieces that had been too worthless to sell and too fake to create scandal. One by one, they discovered that nearly all of them showed signs of authenticity that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. A reproduction, Ming vase showed proper aging patterns and construction techniques. A replica, Roman coin, bore tool marks consistent with ancient minting processes. A fake medieval manuscript used ink and parchment that matched the supposed time period. Eleanor didn't just hide the valuable pieces, Marco realized. She created a whole false narrative that made the remaining collection appear worthless, while actually preserving hundreds of authentic artifacts in plain sight. The woman was a genius, Dr. Chen said with genuine admiration. She outmaneuvered people who thought they were so much smarter than she was. But David was looking troubled. If all these pieces are authentic, then the scandal was based on a complete lie. Eleanor didn't defraud anyone. The board members who accused her were the actual criminals, and they used her protective measures as evidence of guilt. Marco felt a deep anger building in his chest. Eleanor Whitmore had sacrificed her reputation, her career, and ultimately her entire life to protect artifacts that belonged to the community. And in return, she'd been branded a criminal and driven away from everything she cared about. "We have to clear her name," he said quietly. "Whatever else we accomplish, we owe her that much." "Agreed," said Dr. Chen, "but we need to be strategic about how we do it. Harrison Webb is still alive, still influential in this town. Dr. Pemberton retired, but he's still around. If we accuse them publicly of crimes they committed 20 years ago, they'll fight back," David finished, "and they'll have lawyers and money and political connections." Marco thought about that challenge, but his resolve only strengthened. "Then we make sure we have overwhelming evidence before we make any accusations. We document everything, verify everything, and present a case so airtight that they can't deny it. And we include Detective Reynolds from the beginning," Dr. Chen added. "If this becomes a legal matter, we want law enforcement on our side." As they prepared to leave the museum that evening, David paused in the main exhibition hall, looking around at the empty display cases with new understanding. "It's weird to think about," he said. "All these years, people walking past this building thinking it was cursed or evil or whatever, but really, it was like a sanctuary. Eleanor turned it into this secret place where history was protected and preserved. And now it's our responsibility to finish what she started," Marco said. David nodded seriously. "Do you think she knew? When she was hiding everything, do you think she knew that someday someone would figure it out?" Marco looked around the hall, imagining Eleanor working alone in these rooms 20 years ago, making desperate decisions to protect things she loved from people she'd trusted. The loneliness and courage that must have required was almost overwhelming to consider. "I think she hoped," he said finally. "I think she had to believe that someday someone would care enough to look for the truth. Someone like us. Someone like us." As they walked out into the cool evening air, Marco felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. They weren't just hunting for treasure anymore. They were carrying forward Eleanor Whitmore's legacy, fighting to restore her reputation and ensure that her sacrifices hadn't been in vain. The real work was just beginning, and somewhere in this town were people who had built comfortable lives on the lies that destroyed Eleanor's. People who wouldn't give up their secrets easily, and who had far more to lose now than they'd had 20 years ago. But Marco was no longer the defeated, unemployed teacher who'd inherited a cursed building. He was Eleanor's successor, the guardian she'd trusted to continue her work. And with David by his side and Dr. Chen's support, he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The silver locket lay open on Marco's kitchen table like a tiny book telling its secrets. Inside, where a lover's photograph might normally rest, Eleanor had placed a picture of a young girl, maybe 8 years old, with serious dark eyes and braided hair tied with ribbons. "Who do you think she is?" David asked, examining the photograph through Dr. Chen's magnifying glass. Dr. Chen, who had joined them for their evening research session, looked troubled. "I never knew Eleanor had any family. She always seemed completely devoted to the museum, with no mention of children or relatives." Marco turned the locket over, looking for any engravings or markings that might provide a clue. On the back, in tiny script, were the initials EW to AW, for when you're old enough to understand. "AW," Marco said softly. "Another Whitmore?" "Her daughter, maybe," David suggested. "Or a niece?" Dr. Chen was already pulling out her phone. "I can check the Historical Society records, see if there's any mention of Eleanor's family. Give me a few minutes." While Dr. Chen made calls, Marco and David continued examining the locket. Hidden beneath the photograph was another tiny piece of paper with what appeared to be a poem written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. "When autumn leaves begin to fall, and children's laughter fills the hall, look where the youngest used to play. The treasure sleeps until spring's day." "More clues," David said with excitement. But Marco felt a different emotion entirely. The poem, the photograph, the loving inscription, they painted a picture of Eleanor as more than just a dedicated curator. They revealed her as someone who'd loved a child deeply enough to leave her messages that would last decades. Dr. Chen returned 20 minutes later with information that made the mystery even more poignant. "Eleanor did have a daughter," she said quietly. "Amanda Whitmore, born in 1971, but she died in a car accident in 1979 when she was 8 years old." The room fell silent. Marco looked at the photograph again, seeing not just a pretty child, but a daughter whose loss must have been devastating for Eleanor. "That changes everything," David said softly. "If Eleanor lost her daughter, then saving the museum's collection wasn't just about preserving history. It was about preserving something for children who would never get to see it otherwise." Dr. Chen nodded. "Amanda used to come to the museum after school. The staff all remember her. She'd do her homework in Eleanor's office and help with small tasks around the building. Eleanor used to say Amanda would run the museum someday." Marco felt tears threatening. Eleanor's determination to protect the collection took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of a mother's grief. She hadn't just been saving artifacts. She'd been honoring her daughter's memory and ensuring that other children would have the chance Amanda never got. "The poem," Marco said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not just another clue. It's a message to Amanda, telling her where something special is hidden." They made their way to the museum in the gathering darkness, all three of them affected by the evening's revelations. The building felt different now, not like a place of scandal and mystery, but like a monument to love and loss. Where would a child play in the museum? Dr. Chen wondered as they stood in the main hall. David was already moving toward a corner area that had once housed a small reading nook for visiting school groups. "Here," he said with certainty. This would be where kids would naturally gather. The reading nook had been stripped of its furniture, but the walls still showed faded outlines where colorful posters had once hung. David knelt in the corner, running his hands along the baseboard. "There's something here," he said. "The molding is loose." Behind the loose molding was another of Eleanor's hidden compartments, but this one felt different from the others, more personal. Inside was a small wooden box painted with flowers and butterflies, clearly a child's treasure box. Marco's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were mementos that spoke of a mother's love and a daughter's interrupted life. A school report card with all A's. A handmade Mother's Day card, decorated with pressed flowers. A small ceramic figurine of a horse, amateur but lovingly crafted. And beneath these personal treasures was a letter in Eleanor's handwriting, addressed simply to, "My darling Amanda." Marco read the letter aloud, his voice breaking several times. "My precious daughter, if you are reading this, then you are finally old enough to understand why Mommy had to make some difficult choices. The museum we both love so much is in danger from people who don't understand what it means to preserve beautiful things for others to enjoy. I have hidden our most precious artifacts where only someone who truly loves this place will find them. Not because they are worth money, but because they tell stories that need to be told. Stories of people who lived long ago, who created beautiful things, who hoped their creations would survive to inspire others. You always understood that, sweet girl. You saw the magic in every exhibit, the wonder in every artifact. You knew that these weren't just old things in glass cases, they were connections to all the people who came before us. I hope that someday, when you are grown, you will help me restore this place to what it should be. A place where children can discover the same magic you discovered. A place where the past comes alive to teach us about ourselves. Remember, my darling, the greatest treasure in any museum is not what's locked in the display cases. It's the wonder in a child's eyes when they realize they are part of something larger than themselves. All my love forever. Mommy. The silence that followed was profound. Marco carefully refolded the letter, understanding now that Eleanor's mission had been far more complex than protecting valuable artifacts from thieves. She had been trying to preserve wonder itself, to ensure that the capacity for amazement and discovery would survive for future generations. She wrote this after Amanda died, Dr. Chen said quietly. She kept working, kept fighting for the museum, even after losing the person who mattered most to her. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. She did all this for kids she'd never meet, for people like us. Marco felt a profound shift in his understanding of their quest. Finding Eleanor's hidden collection wasn't just about solving a mystery or clearing her name. It was about continuing a mission that went beyond any individual's interests. "We have a responsibility," he said quietly, "not just to find the artifacts, but to make sure they end up where Eleanor wanted them, where children can see them and learn from them." Over the following days, they approached their investigation with renewed purpose. The poem's reference to "When Spring's Day Comes" led them to research the museum's seasonal programming. Chen discovered that Eleanor had always planned a special spring exhibition for local schoolchildren, featuring artifacts that told stories of renewal and growth. The exhibition space had been on the museum's east wing, in a room with large windows that would have been filled with morning sunlight during spring months. When they examined the room carefully, they found evidence of Eleanor's most sophisticated hiding place yet. Built into the window seats were storage compartments that could only be accessed by solving a series of simple puzzles, the kind that would challenge a bright child, but wouldn't be impossible for an adult to figure out. Eleanor had designed her hiding place to be discoverable by the next generation of curious minds. Inside these compartments was the largest cache they'd found yet, artifacts that seemed chosen specifically for their ability to inspire wonder in young visitors. A collection of ancient children's toys from various civilizations, fossils of creatures that would capture any child's imagination. Beautiful examples of traditional crafts from cultures around the world. Each piece came with detailed notes, not just about provenance and value, but about the stories they could tell. Eleanor had been thinking like the educator she was, curating a collection that would spark curiosity and encourage learning. "Look at this," David said, holding up Eleanor's notes about a small Maya figurine. She doesn't just describe what it is, she talks about the child who might have played with it 1,000 years ago, what their daily life might have been like, how they were probably not so different from kids today. Marco read through more of Eleanor's educational notes, seeing her teaching philosophy reflected in every description. She had understood that the real value of these artifacts lay not in their monetary worth, but in their ability to connect present-day visitors with the full span of human experience. As they documented this cache, Marco found himself thinking about his own teaching career and what had drawn him to education in the first place. He remembered the moment in his own childhood when a teacher had shown him an arrowhead found in a local field, and how that simple artifact had opened his eyes to the reality that other people had lived and worked and played in the same landscape he knew. She would have been an amazing teacher, he told David, as they carefully repackaged the artifacts. She was an amazing teacher, David corrected. Just not in a classroom. This whole place was her classroom, and we're still her students. That evening, as they prepared to head home, David made an observation that stopped Marco in his tracks. "Dad, I've been thinking about what Detective Reynolds said about the statute of limitations. Even if we prove Harrison, Webb and the others were criminals, they can't be prosecuted for crimes that happened 20 years ago." That's true. But what if the crimes didn't stop 20 years ago? What if they're still covering up what they did? Marco felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Think about it. If Eleanor's artifacts are ever discovered, if the truth about the scandal comes out, then Webb and the others are exposed as liars and thieves. Their reputations are ruined, maybe their business relationships, their standing in the community. They've got to know that's a possibility. So you think they might try to stop us from revealing the truth? David nodded grimly. I think they might already be trying to stop us. Haven't you noticed how many people suddenly know about our restoration project? How the newspaper article appeared so quickly. Someone's been asking questions about what we're doing here. Marco realized his son was right. The increased attention from townspeople, the sudden interest from Detective Reynolds, even the timing of certain conversations all suggested that word of their activities was spreading in ways they hadn't intended. We need to be more careful, Marco said, and we need to document everything we find immediately, with copies stored somewhere safe. And we need to figure out exactly what Eleanor was planning for the main cache in the basement. Because if that location contains the most valuable artifacts, it's also the most dangerous for us to excavate. As they locked up the museum that night, Marco felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. They were no longer just treasure hunters or amateur historians. They were the guardians of Eleanor Whitmore's legacy, and that legacy was apparently valuable enough that someone might be willing to do more than just discourage their investigation. Standing in the shadows of Greystone's quiet streets, Marco looked back at the museum and made a silent promise to Eleanor and to Amanda, to all the children who would never get to see these wonders if the truth remained buried. Whatever the risks, whatever the opposition, he would see this through to the end. Eleanor had sacrificed everything to preserve these treasures for future generations. The least he could do was ensure her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The envelope appeared on a rainy Tuesday morning, slipped under the museum's front door sometime during the night. Marco found it when he arrived for his usual early morning work session, his name written across the front in careful script that looked somehow familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made his hands shake. You're looking in the right places, but asking the wrong questions. If you want the truth about what happened to Eleanor Whitmore, meet me at the Riverside Diner tonight at 8 p.m. Come alone and bring the compass. A friend. Marco stared at the note for a long time, his mind racing. Someone had been watching their investigation, knew about the compass, knew enough about their progress to realize they were close to major discoveries. But who? And why reveal themselves now? He called David immediately, but his son was in school. Dr. Chen didn't answer her phone. Detective Reynolds was in court all day, according to the police desk sergeant. Marco spent the morning pacing the museum floors, the mysterious note burning in his pocket like an accusation. By afternoon, He'd made his decision. He would go to the meeting, but he wouldn't go completely unprepared. He wrote a detailed letter explaining everything they'd discovered, sealed it in an envelope addressed to Detective Reynolds, and left it in his apartment with instructions for his landlord to deliver it if anything happened to him. The Riverside Diner sat on the edge of town, a 1950s-style establishment that served as an unofficial community center for Greystone's older residents. Marco arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a booth near the back where he could watch the entrance. At exactly 8 o'clock, a woman entered the diner and made her way directly to his table. She was perhaps 70 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd lived a life of caution, but her presence commanded attention. "Mr. Silva," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Thank you for coming. Do I know you?" "Not exactly, but I know you. I've been watching your work at the museum with great interest." She smiled, and something about the expression seemed achingly familiar. "My name is Amanda Whitmore." Marco's world tilted sideways. "That's impossible. Amanda Whitmore died in a car accident in 1979. Amanda Whitmore disappeared in 1979, the woman corrected gently. The death was staged to protect her from people who would have used her to control her mother. Marco stared at her, his mind struggling to process this revelation. "You're Eleanor's daughter." "I'm Eleanor's daughter, and I'm very much alive, though I've spent the last 25 years being very careful about who knows that." She reached into her purse and withdrew a photograph, the same image Marco had found in Eleanor's locket. But this version was larger, clearer. A second photo showed Eleanor and Amanda together, both of them smiling in the museum's main hall. "I need to see the compass," Amanda said quietly. With trembling hands, Marco placed Eleanor's modified compass on the table between them. Amanda's eyes filled with tears as she touched it. "She made this for me," Amanda said. "Taught me how to read the modifications, how to follow the clues. It was supposed to be a game we'd play together when I was older." Her voice broke slightly. "She never got the chance to show me how it worked." "Why did you fake your death?" Amanda glanced around the diner, making sure their conversation couldn't be overheard. "In 1979, my mother discovered that Harrison Webb and his associates weren't just planning to steal artifacts from the museum. They were involved in a much larger network smuggling antiquities out of the country, selling to private collectors who didn't ask questions about provenance." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mother found documents proving they'd been using the museum as a front for their operations for years, bringing in stolen artifacts, giving them false provenance through museum records, then selling them to accomplish laundering." Marco felt sick. "And they threatened you to keep Eleanor quiet." "They didn't just threaten. Dr. Pemberton told my mother quite clearly that little girls sometimes had accidents, car accidents, drowning accidents, falls downstairs. He said it would be tragic if something happened to me because my mother couldn't mind her own business." The casual evil of it made Marco's anger flare. "So Eleanor agreed to fake your death?" "No, I ran away." Amanda's voice grew stronger, more defiant. "I was 8 years old, but I understood what was happening. I heard Dr. Pemberton threaten my mother. So I took my bicycle and rode to my aunt's house in Philadelphia, 3 hours away. I told her everything." "And your aunt helped stage the accident?" "My aunt, Rachel, was a nurse. She understood that sometimes the only way to protect someone is to make them disappear completely. We staged the car accident using a body from the hospital, Morgia, young Jane Doe who'd never been identified. The dental records were switched. The DNA testing didn't exist then like it does now." Marco shook his head in amazement. "But why didn't Eleanor expose Webb and the others after you were safely hidden?" Amanda's expression grew pained. "Because she realized the corruption went deeper than just the museum board. Dr. Pemberton had connections with law enforcement, judges, politicians. If Mother had gone public with what she knew, she would have been discredited or worse. and there was always the chance that someone would discover I was still alive. So she chose to save the artifacts instead of clearing her name. She chose to do what she could with the power she had. She couldn't stop the smuggling operation entirely, but she could make sure the museum's legitimate collection survived. Amanda touched the compass again. She spent 5 years planning her strategy, creating the hiding places, preparing the false narratives that would protect the real artifacts. And then she disappeared too. Not disappeared. She went into hiding, just like I did. We've been in contact all these years, but never directly, never in ways that could be traced back to either of us. Marco's mind reeled with the implications. Eleanor is still alive? Amanda smiled through her tears. Very much alive. Living quietly in a small town in Montana, working as a librarian under an assumed name. She's been waiting for 20 years for someone to find her clues and start asking the right questions. Why didn't she just come back once the statute of limitations expired? Once the immediate danger was past? Because the danger was never past. Webb and his associates built their entire lives on the wealth they stole. If the truth comes out, they don't just face social embarrassment, they face civil lawsuits, forfeiture of assets, destruction of everything they've built. People like that don't just give up. Amanda reached across the table and took Marco's hand. They know about your investigation. Webb has been asking questions around town, trying to figure out exactly what you've found. Dr. Pemberton's son works for the county planning office. She's been reviewing permit applications, looking for any indication that you're planning to excavate. How do you know all this? Because I never really left Greystone. I've lived here under different names, different identities, keeping watch, making sure no one got too close to Mother's secrets before the right person came along. Marco stared at her. You've been here the whole time? Sometimes as a college student doing research at the Historical Society. Sometimes as a tourist interested in local history. For the past 5 years, as a homeless woman who spends time around the museum grounds. The revelation hit Marco like a physical blow. The woman with the cart, the one who sleeps in the alley behind the hardware store. Amanda nodded. I've been watching you since you first inherited the building. Watching how you treated the museum, how you approached its history, whether you had the respect and patience necessary to understand what Mother was trying to preserve. You've been testing me. We both have. Mother designed her clues to reveal themselves only to someone who truly cared about the collection's historical value, not just its monetary worth. Someone who would take the time to research properly, who would treat the artifacts with respect. Marco thought about all the careful documentation they'd done, all the hours David had spent learning about proper archival techniques, all the research into Eleanor's background and motivations. We passed the test? Amanda's smile was radiant. You passed with flying colors. Both of you. David's enthusiasm for the historical aspects of the mystery, his careful attention to detail, Mother would have loved working with him. Does this mean you'll help us find the main cache? It means I'm going to take you to see my mother. Tomorrow night. She has something for you that will make the basement excavation unnecessary. Amanda reached into her purse again and withdrew a sealed letter addressed to the next guardian. She wrote this 20 years ago when she first went into hiding. She's been waiting all this time for the right person to give it to. Marco accepted the letter with trembling hands, understanding that this moment represented the culmination of everything they'd been working toward. Mr. Silva, Amanda said as she prepared to leave, there's something else you should know. Webb and his associates haven't just been watching your investigation. They've been planning to stop it, permanently, if necessary. What do you mean? I mean they're going to try to have you arrested for theft. They're planning to claim that any artifacts you've found were stolen from the museum during the closure, that you're a grave robber taking advantage of a tragic situation. Marco felt cold dread settle in his stomach. Can they do that? They can try. They have money, lawyers, and 20 years of respectability to trade on. But they don't have what we have. Which is? Amanda stood up, her expression fierce with determination. The truth. All of it. Everything my mother documented, everything she preserved, every piece of evidence that proves they were the real criminals. As she walked away, Amanda paused at the diner's entrance and looked back. Bring David tomorrow night. He's earned the right to meet the woman whose legacy he's been helping to preserve. And Mr. Silva, thank you. You've given my mother something she thought she'd never have again, hope that her sacrifices meant something. Marco sat alone in the diner for a long time after Amanda left, Eleanor's letter unopened in his hands. Everything he'd thought he knew about their investigation had changed in a single conversation. Eleanor wasn't. Whitmore wasn't a tragic figure who died in disgrace, was a hero who'd sacrificed everything to protect treasures that belonged to the world. And now, after 20 years of patient waiting, she was ready to finish what she'd started. With Marco and David as her allies, and with Amanda finally able to step out of the shadows, they would face whatever Webb and his associates could throw at them. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since this all started, Marco felt like they might actually win. Eleanor's letter, written 20 years ago but feeling urgently contemporary, contained instructions that would change everything. To the guardian who finds this message, the basement cache contains the most valuable pieces, but not because of their monetary worth. Hidden beneath the concrete floor are documents that prove Webb and his associates' criminal conspiracy, along with artifacts they stole from other institutions. This evidence cannot be safely excavated without proper legal protection. Take this letter to Detective Patricia Reynolds. She was a rookie officer during the original investigation and asked questions her superiors didn't want answered. She can be trusted with the truth. The master key you've been carrying opens not just the main vault, but a safety deposit box at First National Bank, registered under the name A. Museum Guardian. Inside you'll find complete documentation of the smuggling operation, including financial records, correspondence with corrupt dealers, and photographic evidence of the stolen artifacts. Present this evidence to Detective Reynolds first. Only when you have legal protection should you proceed with the basement excavation. Webb and his associates will move quickly once they realize their secrets are about to be exposed. You must be faster. Marco read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Eleanor hadn't just hidden valuable artifacts, she'd documented an entire criminal conspiracy that could still bring down powerful people. The next morning, Marco and David met Detective Reynolds at the police station. She listened to their story with growing amazement, examining Eleanor's journal, Amanda's testimony, and finally the master key that Eleanor claimed would unlock a safety deposit box full of evidence. This changes everything we thought we knew about the Whitmore case, Detective Reynolds said as she studied the documents. If even half of what's in here is true, we're talking about conspiracy, fraud, theft of cultural artifacts, and possibly money laundering on a massive scale. What's our next step? Marco asked. We go to the bank, right now, before word of this spreads any further. Detective Reynolds gathered the papers with careful efficiency. If Eleanor really documented everything the way she claims, this safety deposit box could contain evidence of federal crimes with no statute of limitations. The drive to First National Bank felt surreal. David sat quietly in the back seat, the weight of their discovery settling over all of them. They weren't just solving a 20-year-old mystery anymore, they were potentially exposing ongoing criminal activity. Bank manager Patricia Flores examined the key and documentation with professional skepticism until she verified the account records. This box has been paid for 20 years in advance, she said with surprise. The rental agreement was signed by someone called A Museum Guardian, with all fees paid through an automatic trust account. Eleanor thought of everything, David murmured, as they were led to the vault. The safety deposit box was larger than Marco had expected, and when opened, it revealed Eleanor's meticulous preparation. File folders organized by date and subject contained photocopies of invoices, shipping manifests, and correspondence that painted a damning picture of Webb's operation. Detective Reynolds whistled softly as she examined a folder labeled Financial Records. Look at this. Webb was billing the museum for conservation work that never happened. then using those fake invoices to justify transferring artifacts to restoration specialists who turned out to be black market dealers. Another folder contained photographs of artifacts in various locations, some in Webb's personal collection, others in the homes of his associates, still others in galleries and auction houses around the world. She documented where everything ended up, Marco said with admiration. Even after she went into hiding, Eleanor was still investigating, still gathering evidence. The most damaging folder was labeled Current Operations. It contained recent documents, receipts, emails, and financial records from the past 5 years, showing that Webb's smuggling network was still active. "This isn't just historical evidence," Detective Reynolds said grimly. "This is proof of ongoing criminal activity. We need federal backup for this." But as they prepared to leave the bank, Patricia Flores approached them with a worried expression. "Excuse me, Detective Reynolds? I thought you should know about an hour ago. We had another visitor asking about this same safety deposit box. Harrison Webb claimed to be conducting a legal investigation into the old museum case." Detective Reynolds and Marco exchanged alarmed glances. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing, of course. Bank confidentiality prevents us from discussing account details with unauthorized parties. But he seemed very insistent that the box contained evidence relevant to an ongoing investigation." "He knows," David said quietly. "Someone told him we found the letter." Detective Reynolds was already on her radio, calling for backup and requesting surveillance on Webb's home and business. "We need to move fast. If Webb realizes we have Eleanor's evidence, he'll either try to flee or try to destroy what we've found." They returned to the museum under police escort, but the building felt different now, no longer a sanctuary for quiet investigation, but potentially a target for desperate people with everything to lose. "We need to get Amanda and arrange the meeting with Eleanor," Marco said as they secured the documents in Detective Reynolds' patrol car. "If Webb is mobilizing his resources, we're going to need all the evidence we can get." But Amanda was nowhere to be found. The alley where she usually sheltered was empty, her makeshift possessions scattered as if she'd left in a hurry. David discovered a note tucked under a loose brick near the museum's back entrance. "They know about tonight's meeting. Taking alternative route to Mother. Stay safe. Trust Detective Reynolds. She's protecting Eleanor," Marco realized. "If Webb knows about our investigation, he might know about the planned meeting." Detective Reynolds received a call that made her expression turn grim. "Webb's house appears to be empty. His vehicles are gone, and neighbors reported seeing moving trucks there yesterday. He's running or regrouping. Either way, we need to secure the basement cache before he has a chance to interfere with the excavation." Back at the museum, they discovered that someone had indeed been there. The basement showed signs of disturbance tools scattered, the concrete floor marked where someone had been testing for the exact location of Eleanor's cache. "They've been here," David said, examining scratches in the concrete that hadn't been there the day before. Someone was trying to find the exact spot to dig. Detective Reynolds called for a crime scene team and archaeological supervision for the excavation. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Legal, documented, with proper chain of custody for any evidence we find." As they waited for the specialists to arrive, Marco found himself thinking about Eleanor and Amanda, living in the shadows for 20 years, while the people who'd destroyed their lives prospered openly. The injustice of it fueled his determination to see this through, regardless of the risks. "Dad," David said, interrupting his thoughts, "look at this." David was examining the modified compass again, and as he held it over the marked area of the basement floor, the needle began spinning wildly. "It's not just pointing to magnetic objects," David realized. "It's reacting to something electrical, maybe electronic." Detective Reynolds borrowed the compass and watched the needle's behavior. Eleanor might have hidden more than just artifacts and documents down there. If she was documenting ongoing criminal activity, she might have included recording devices or other electronic evidence. The implications were staggering. If Eleanor had recorded conversations with Webb and his associates, if she'd documented their activities in real time before disappearing, the evidence could be even more damaging than they'd imagined. As the sun set over Greystone, Marco stood in the museum's main hall surrounded by police officers, archaeologists, and evidence technicians. The building that had been his refuge and David's playground was now the center of what could become one of the largest art theft investigations in the region's history. "Are you ready for this?" Detective Reynolds asked him. "Once we start digging, there's no going back. Whatever we find down there is going to change a lot of lives, probably including yours." Marco looked at David, who nodded with the serious expression of someone far older than his 15 years. They'd come too far and learned too much to turn back now. "Eleanor Whitmore trusted her legacy to the right person," Marco said. "She deserves to have her story told, and the people she was protecting deserve justice. Then let's finish what she started." As the excavation team prepared their equipment, Marco touched the brass key in his pocket, the key that had started their entire journey. Tomorrow, they would uncover the final secrets Eleanor had hidden beneath the museum floor. They would face whatever Webb and his associates could throw at them, and they would ensure that Eleanor Whitmore's 20-year sacrifice finally received the recognition it deserved. The real treasure had never been the monetary value of the artifacts. It had been the truth itself, and the courage to protect it no matter the personal cost. Now it was their turn to be brave enough to see that truth revealed. The excavation began at dawn, with archaeological specialists using ground-penetrating radar to map what lay beneath the basement's concrete floor. Marco and David watched from the stairs as the team worked with scientific precision, marking grid squares and photographing every step of the process. "Contact," called Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead archaeologist, as her equipment detected a large void space approximately 4 feet below the surface. "Looks like a constructed chamber, roughly 8 by 10 feet. Detective Reynolds coordinated with FBI agents who'd arrived overnight once the federal implications of Eleanor's evidence became clear. Agent Michael Torres, a specialist in art theft and cultural property crimes, examined Eleanor's documentation with growing amazement. "This network was more sophisticated than we realized," he told Marco as they watched the excavation. "Eleanor documented connections to dealers in 6 countries, with a money laundering operation that moved millions of dollars through fake museum transactions." "And it's still active?" "Very much so. The bank records your Eleanor-preserved show transfers as recent as last month." Webb wasn't just stealing from one museum 20 years ago. He's been running a systematic looting operation across the entire region. The first artifacts emerged around noon, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved in custom-built containers that spoke to Eleanor's careful planning. But it was the electronic equipment that drew the most attention: recording devices, cameras, and what appeared to be a sophisticated surveillance system. "She was documenting everything," Dr. Martinez said with professional admiration. "Look at this setup. Motion, activated cameras, digital recorders, even a backup power supply. This woman was thinking like a modern investigator 20 years before the technology was widely available." David peered into the excavated chamber as the team carefully removed artifacts. "Dad, look at that mask. It's incredible." The ceremonial mask was indeed extraordinarily carved from what appeared to be jade and obsidian, with intricate details that suggested Mesoamerican origin. Even from a distance, Marco could see that it represented the kind of cultural artifact that belonged in a major museum, not in some private collector's vault. "Mayan, probably 8th or 9th century," Agent Torres confirmed after consulting with Dr. Martinez. "This piece alone is worth several $1 million, but its cultural value is incalculable. If Webb's network had succeeded in selling this, it would likely have disappeared into private hands forever." But the real breakthrough came when the excavation team uncovered Eleanor's documentation, Volta waterproof container filled with files, photographs, and recording equipment that had preserved 20 years of evidence. Detective Reynolds opened the first file folder with careful precision. Inside were transcripts of recorded conversations between Webb and his associates, detailing their methods for stealing and laundering cultural artifacts. "Listen to this," she said, reading from a transcript dated August 1984. Webb says, "The Whitmore woman is getting too close. We need to discredit her before she can cause real problems. If we can make it look like she's been stealing from the museum, we can shut down her investigation and take control of the remaining collection." Marco felt sick. They destroyed her reputation deliberately. "It gets worse," Detective Reynolds continued reading. Pemberton responds, "What about the kid? If the mother won't cooperate, maybe something happens to the daughter." Webb says, "Accidents happen. 8-year-olds are careless around traffic." The casual way they discussed threatening a child made David pale with anger. "These people are monsters." Agent Torres was examining photographs from Eleanor's collection. She documented everything. "Look at this Webb's personal residence in 1985, showing artifacts that were reported stolen from 3 different museums. And here's his current Florida property, with pieces that match Interpol's list of missing cultural treasures." How did Eleanor get access to all this information? "She was brilliant and patient," Detective Reynolds said, reading through more files. "She spent 5 years after Amanda's supposed death building a case. She posed as an art dealer, infiltrated their network, gained their trust. They thought she was a potential buyer for stolen pieces. The recording equipment yielded even more damaging evidence. Hours of conversations between Webb and international dealers discussing the movement of stolen artifacts through legitimate auction houses and private galleries. This is enough to bring down the entire network, Agent Torres said with satisfaction. Eleanor Whitmore may have been the most effective undercover investigator in art theft history. But their triumph was interrupted by a commotion upstairs. Marco heard raised voices, car doors slamming, and Detective Reynolds's radio crackling with urgent communications. "We have a problem," Officer Martinez called down to them. "Harrison Webb is here, with a lawyer and a court order claiming authority over the excavation." Marco and David climbed to the main floor to find Webb in the museum's entrance hall, flanked by 2 expensive-looking attorneys and what appeared to be private security personnel. At 73, Webb was still an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that suggested decades of getting his way through intimidation. "Mr. Silva," Webb said with cold politeness, "I understand you've been playing archaeologist in my old museum." "Your museum?" "Legally speaking, yes. The board of directors never formally transferred ownership after the scandal. The inheritance you received was invalid due to unresolved liens on the property." Webb's lawyer produced a thick folder of documents. "We have a court order requiring you to cease all excavation activities and surrender any artifacts you've removed." Detective Reynolds stepped forward. "Mr. Webb, I'm afraid your court order is superseded by a federal investigation. This is now a crime scene under FBI jurisdiction." "Crime scene?" Webb's expression didn't change. But Marco caught a flicker of something, fear, maybe, or calculation. "I'm not aware of any crimes being investigated here." Agent Torres emerged from the basement, carrying one of Eleanor's evidence folders. "Harrison Webb, you're under arrest for conspiracy to steal cultural artifacts, money laundering, and interstate transportation of stolen property." The change in Webb was immediate and dramatic. The polished businessman facade cracked, revealing something desperate underneath. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove anything. That Whitmore woman was delusional. Everyone knows that." "Actually, Mr. Webb, Eleanor Whitmore was remarkably thorough in documenting your criminal activities." Agent Torres opened the folder and began reading. "We have recordings of you discussing the sale of artifacts stolen from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We have financial records showing illegal transfers through offshore accounts. We have photographs of stolen pieces in your personal collection." Webb's lawyers began conferring in urgent whispers, but Webb himself seemed to deflate as the reality of the situation sank in. "She's dead," he said weakly. "Eleanor Whitmore died 20 years ago." "Actually, said a voice from the museum's entrance. "I'm very much alive." Everyone turned to see Eleanor Whitmore walking through the front door, accompanied by Amanda and two federal marshals. At 71, Eleanor moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd carried a heavy burden for decades, but was finally ready to set it down. Marco's breath caught. Eleanor was smaller than he'd imagined, with white hair and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But her presence filled the room as she looked directly at Webb for the first time in 20 years. "Hello, Harrison," she said quietly. "I told you that someday the truth would come out." Webb stared at her, as if seeing a ghost, his face cycling through disbelief, fear, and finally rage. "You destroyed everything. The museum, the community's trust, my reputation." "I preserved what mattered," Eleanor interrupted. "The artifacts, the history, the cultural heritage you were selling to the highest bidder. That's what a real curator does." Amanda stepped forward, no longer hiding her identity. "And I'm Amanda Whitmore, the daughter you threatened to kill. Surprise children can be more resourceful than you think." The confrontation that followed would be talked about in Greystone for years to come. Webb's attempt to maintain his innocence crumbled as Agent Torres presented piece after piece of Eleanor's evidence. His associates, contacted by FBI agents across 3 states, began cooperating immediately when faced with the overwhelming documentation Eleanor had compiled. As Webb was led away in handcuffs, he turned back to Eleanor with pure hatred in his eyes. "You could have been wealthy. We offered you partnership, profit, respect. Instead, you chose to live like a beggar for 20 years. Eleanor's response was calm and certain. "I chose to live with dignity. I chose to protect things that matter more than money. I chose to preserve wonder for children like Amanda and David and all the others who will come after us." Watching Webb disappear into a federal vehicle, Marco felt a profound sense of completion. The mystery that had consumed their lives for months was finally resolved. But more than that, justice had been served for a woman who'd sacrificed everything to do what was right. In the quiet that followed Webb's arrest, Eleanor walked slowly through the museum she'd sacrificed so much to protect. Marco and David flanked her as she examined the empty display cases, the cleaned floors, the restored windows that now let sunlight stream across the marble floors. "You've taken wonderful care of this place," Eleanor said softly, running her fingers along a display case that Marco had painstakingly cleaned and repaired. "It feels alive again." "It was always alive," David said with the confidence of youth. "It was just waiting for the right people to notice." Eleanor smiled at him with genuine warmth. "You remind me of Amanda at your age, curious, thoughtful, willing to see possibilities where others see only problems." Amanda approached with a wooden box in her hand ornately carved with symbols that seemed to dance in the afternoon light. "Mother, I think it's time." Eleanor nodded and accepted the box with careful reverence. "This contains the most important piece of the collection. Not the most valuable in monetary terms, but the most significant for what we're trying to accomplish here." She opened the box to reveal what appeared to be a simple, hand-carved figure of a child reading a book. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but not obviously ancient or rare. Yet something about the piece seemed to radiate significance. "This was carved by my great-grandmother," Eleanor explained. "She was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Pennsylvania. She made this figure for children who were afraid of books, who thought learning was something beyond their reach." She placed the figure in Marco's hands. "She used to tell them that knowledge belongs to everyone, that wonder is the birthright of every child, and that their job as adults would be to pass that wonder on to the next generation." Marco felt the weight of symbolism in the simple wooden figure. This is what the museum is really about. Exactly. All the valuable artifacts, all the treasures we've protected, they're only meaningful if they inspire that sense of wonder. If they help children understand that they're part of something larger than themselves. Agent Torres interrupted their conversation with news that would reshape everything. "Ms. Whitmore, I've just received word from our international task force. Webb's network included dealers and collectors in 12 countries. The total value of artifacts they stole and laundered over the past 20 years exceeds 400 million. Eleanor absorbed this information with sad composure. I always suspected the scope was enormous. That's why I couldn't risk exposing them until I had overwhelming evidence. The good news is that we're recovering artifacts from around the world. Museums that unknowingly purchased stolen pieces are cooperating with repatriation efforts. Some of the cultural treasures that were thought lost forever are coming home. Amanda looked at her mother with pride. You did it. After 20 years, you actually stopped them. But Eleanor's expression remained serious. We stopped this network. But there are others. Cultural theft is a global problem that requires constant vigilance. She turned to Marco. That's why institutions like this museum matter so much. They create awareness, education, respect for cultural heritage. Detective Reynolds approached with a folder of documents. Eleanor, we need to discuss the legal status of the artifacts you preserved. Technically, they belonged to the museum at the time of its closure. Which means they belong to Marco now, Eleanor said without hesitation, as the legal owner of the museum property. But more importantly, they belong to the community. They belong to the children who will visit here, who will learn from them. Marco felt the enormous responsibility settling on his shoulders. I want to reopen the museum. Do this right, the way you originally intended. With what resources? Amanda asked practically. Restoration will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Operating expenses, insurance, staffing. Actually, Agent Torres interjected, there's something else. Webb's assets are being seized as proceeds of criminal activity. Under federal forfeiture laws, a portion of recovered funds can be designated for cultural preservation projects. If Marco applies to establish a legitimate museum foundation, the Webb Foundation money could fund the restoration. Eleanor finished, understanding immediately. Poetic justice. Dr. Chen arrived as they were discussing logistics, bringing with her several other members of Greystone's Historical Society and news that the local newspaper was planning a major story about the investigation. The whole town is talking about this, she reported. People are starting to understand what really happened 20 years ago and what you've been working toward. By evening, word had spread throughout Greystone. Townspeople began gathering outside the museum, not with the skepticism Marco had grown accustomed to, but with curiosity and excitement. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store brought coffee and sandwiches for the investigators. Harold Brennan from the hardware store offered to donate materials for the restoration project. It's like the whole community is waking up, David observed, watching the growing crowd through the museum's windows. Eleanor stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. This is what I dreamed of for 20 years. The museum as a center of community pride, a place where people come together to celebrate learning and discovery. As the federal agents completed their evidence collection and the archaeological team finished documenting the basement cache, Marco found himself alone with Eleanor in her former office. I need to ask you something, he said quietly. Why me? Out of all the people who might have inherited this building, why was I the one who found your clues? Eleanor considered the question seriously. I think it was because you understood loss. You knew what it felt like to have something precious taken away from you. That made you careful with the precious things you found here. She gestured toward the window, where David could be seen talking enthusiastically with Amanda about the restoration plans. And because you understood that the most valuable treasures aren't things, they're relationships. The bond you've rebuilt with David through this investigation is worth more than all the artifacts we've recovered. Marco nodded, understanding. His relationship with David had indeed been transformed through their shared adventure. The sullen, distant teenager who'd reluctantly visited the museum months ago had become a confident, engaged young man who spoke passionately about history and preservation. Will you stay in Greystone? Marco asked. Help us establish the new museum. Eleanor smiled. I think my wandering days are over. It's time to come home and finish what I started. But Marco, her expression grew serious. The new museum needs to be yours, not mine. I'm part of its past. You and David and Amanda, you're its future. As the evening wound down and the crowds began to disperse, Eleanor produced one final gifter leather-bound ledger that contained her detailed plans for the museum's educational programs. "I spent years developing these curricula," she explained. "Programs designed to make history come alive for children, to help them understand that the past isn't something distant and irrelevant, but something that connects directly to their own lives." The ledger contained detailed lesson plans, suggested exhibitions, and innovative approaches to making museums interactive and engaging for young visitors. "This is incredible," Marco said, reading through Eleanor's notes. "You've thought of everything." "I had 20 years to think," Eleanor replied with a wry smile, "and nothing but hope to sustain me." As they prepared to leave the museum that night, Amanda approached Marco with a proposal that would cement their partnership. "I'd like to apply for the position of assistant curator," she said formally. "I may not have traditional credentials, but I have 20 years of experience protecting cultural artifacts and a deep understanding of this institution's mission." Marco extended his hand without hesitation. "I can't think of anyone more qualified for the position." Standing in the museum's entrance hall as the last of the investigators departed, Marco looked around at the space that had transformed his life. Empty display cases waited to be filled with wonders. Clean floors reflected the promise of visitors who would walk these halls in amazement. Windows sparkled with the light of possibility. "Ready to go home?" David asked, but Marco realized that this building had become home in ways his small apartment never could. "Ready to start tomorrow," Marco replied. "We have a museum to build." 6 months later, the Greystone City Museum reopened its doors to a community transformed by the knowledge of its true history. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Local Museum Rises from Ashes. The Eleanor Whitmore Legacy Lives On." Marco stood in the main exhibition hall, watching as families moved through displays that told the story not just of ancient civilizations, but of preservation, courage, and the importance of protecting cultural heritage. The centerpiece of the main hall was Eleanor's collection, displayed with educational materials that explained both the artifacts' historical significance and the dramatic story of how they were saved. David, now 16 and serving as the museum's youngest volunteer docent, was leading a group of elementary school children through the Wonder and Discovery exhibit that Eleanor had designed specifically for young visitors. "This pottery vessel was made by a Hopi artist almost 1,000 years ago," David explained, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved what he was teaching. "Think about that, almost 1,000 years ago. Someone sat down with clay and created something beautiful that we can still see and touch today." A little girl raised her hand. "How do we know it's really that old?" "Great question," David replied with a smile that reminded Marco of Eleanor. "Let me tell you about the scientific methods we use to date artifacts, and how Detective Reynolds and the FBI proved that some people had been lying about these treasures for 20 years. The children listened with rapt attention as David wove together history, science, and mystery into a narrative that brought the past to life. Marco felt a deep satisfaction watching his son teach with the same passion that had once driven Marco's own classroom presentations. Eleanor approached, carrying a clipboard and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose life's work was finally bearing fruit. At 71, she moved with renewed energy, her role as director emeritus, giving her purpose without the administrative burdens she'd shouldered for so many years. "The field trip bookings for spring are already filling up," she reported. 6 school districts have requested multi-day programs, and the state university wants to bring archaeology students for hands-on learning experiences. And the Webb Foundation funding. Approved in full. The irony isn't lost on anyone that Harrison Webb's stolen wealth is now funding the exact kind of educational programming he tried to destroy. Eleanor's expression grew serious. "Harrison died in federal prison last month. Heart attack. I wish I could say I felt sorry for him, but mostly I'm just relieved that chapter is finally closed." Marco nodded, understanding her complex feelings. Webb's death had ended any possibility of further revelations about his criminal network, but it also provided a sense of closure for Eleanor and Amanda. Amanda appeared from the basement level, where she was overseeing the installation of a state-of-the-art conservation laboratory. Her official title was Assistant Curator and Collections Manager, but she functioned more as Eleanor's partner in running the daily operations. "The Smithsonian curators are here for the authentication meeting," she announced. "They're very excited about the Maya ceremonial mask. Dr. Rodriguez thinks it might be one of the finest examples of classical period artistry he's ever examined." The Smithsonian's interest represented the museum's growing reputation in the academic community. Eleanor's careful documentation of provenance had made it possible to authenticate pieces that might otherwise have remained questionable, and several major institutions were now partnering with Greystone for research and educational programs. "Any word from the FBI about international recoveries?" Marco asked. "Agent Torres called this morning. They've recovered artifacts worth over 50 million in the past 6 months, with more discoveries happening weekly. Museums around the world are reassessing their collections, looking for pieces that might have come through Webb's network." The afternoon brought Marco's favorite part of the day, the moment when he locked the museum doors and walked through the quiet halls, reflecting on what they'd accomplished. But today, as he made his rounds, he wasn't alone. Sarah had asked to meet him at the museum, their first real conversation in months that wasn't about David's schedule or legal obligations. She stood in the Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Gallery, reading the wall text that told the story of the woman who'd sacrificed everything to preserve cultural treasures. "This is incredible, Marco," Sarah said when he joined her. I knew you were working on something important, but I didn't understand the scope of what you'd discovered." "Thank you, that means a lot coming from you." Sarah turned to face him, her expression softer than he'd seen it in years. "I owe you an apology. When you first inherited this place, I thought it was just another one of your impractical dreams. I didn't understand that sometimes the impractical dreams are the ones worth pursuing." They walked through the museum together, Sarah asking thoughtful questions about the exhibits and restoration process. When they reached the education wing, they found David setting up for an evening program on archaeological techniques. "Mom." David's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Did Dad show you the conservation lab and the new interactive displays? We've got virtual reality programs that let visitors experience historical sites and a hands-on workshop where kids can practice excavation techniques." Sarah listened to her son's enthusiastic explanation with growing amazement. "David, you sound like a museum professional." "I want to study archaeology in college," David said with the confidence of someone who'd found his calling. "Maybe work for the Smithsonian someday, or teach at a university. Dad says I could intern here next summer, get real experience with collection management and educational programming." "That sounds wonderful," Sarah said, and Marco could hear genuine pride in her voice. As evening fell and the museum's public areas emptied, the three of them sat in Eleanor's office Marco's office, and talked about the future. Not as a divorced couple navigating custody arrangements, but as parents proud of their son's achievements and committed to supporting his goals. "I've been thinking," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "David spends most of his free time here anyway, and this work clearly means everything to him. What if we adjusted the custody arrangement? Let him spend more time in Greystone during the school year." Marco felt his heart leap, but he kept his voice steady. "Only if that's what David wants." "It's what I want," David said immediately. "This place feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has, and I want to help build something important." After Sarah and David left together, the first time in months, they'd all shared a positive conversation. Marco remained in the museum alone. He walked through the galleries, checking that everything was secure, but also savoring the quiet satisfaction of work well done. In the main hall, moonlight streamed through the restored windows, illuminating the bronze plaque that had been installed near the entrance. In honor of guardians past and future, this museum stands as testament to those who protect cultural heritage for the benefit of all humanity. Marco touched the plaque gently, thinking about Eleanor's 20-year journey from persecution to vindication. Amanda's courage in living a hidden life to protect her mother's legacy, and his own unexpected transformation from failed teacher to museum director. His phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Dad, I've been researching summer archaeology programs for high school students. There's one at Penn State that looks amazing. Think you could help me apply?" Marco smiled as he typed his response. "I know someone at Penn State who could write you a recommendation letter. Dr. Chen has been talking about expanding our educational partnerships." As he prepared to leave, Marco paused one final time in the doorway of the main exhibition hall. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new questions, new opportunities to share the wonder of discovery with curious minds. School children would touch replica artifacts in the hands-on learning center, teenagers would participate in archaeological simulations, and adults would discover that history was far more fascinating than they'd ever imagined. The museum had become exactly what Eleanor had envisioned, not just a repository for valuable objects, but a living center of learning and community engagement. The gift shop sold books about local history and archaeological techniques. The lecture hall hosted monthly programs featuring guest speakers from universities and museums around the world. The conservation lab offered workshops for amateur historians and collectors who wanted to learn proper preservation techniques. But perhaps most importantly, the museum had restored Greystone's sense of pride and possibility. Property values in the historic district had risen as tourists began visiting the town, specifically to see the museum that had overcome such dramatic challenges. Local businesses reported increased revenue from visitors who came for the museum and stayed to explore the charming downtown area. Marco locked the front doors and walked down the marble steps that had once seemed like a symbol of decay and abandonment. Now they felt solid beneath his feet, leading to a sidewalk where families often gathered in the evenings to read the historical markers that told the story of the building's remarkable resurrection. The brass key, Eleanor's original key that had started their entire adventure now, hung in a place of honor in his office, mounted in a display case with a placard explaining its significance to the museum's rediscovery. But Marco carried a different key now, a modern one that opened doors to a future full of possibility. Walking home through Greystone's quiet streets, Marco reflected on the transformation that had touched every aspect of his life. He had steady employment again, meaningful work that combined his love of history with his passion for education. His relationship with David had evolved from the painful distance of divorce into something stronger, a partnership built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Even his relationship with Sarah had found new footing. She'd begun dating someone new, a kind man who supported her goals and treated David with genuine affection. But more importantly, she and Marco had rediscovered their ability to communicate as concerned parents rather than bitter ex-spouses. The small apartment that had once felt like a symbol of his reduced circumstances now seemed cozy and sufficient. He'd received offers to move into larger places, including Eleanor's former house which had come up for sale, but Marco preferred the simplicity of his current arrangement. Home wasn't about square footage or impressive. It was about connection, purpose, and the knowledge that your work mattered. As he climbed the steps to his building, Marco's phone rang with a call from Dr. Chen. "Marco, I hope I'm not calling too late, but I just received the most interesting proposal. The National Endowment for the Arts wants to feature our museum in a documentary about cultural preservation. They're particularly interested in the story of how community involvement and individual courage can overcome institutional corruption." "That sounds wonderful. What would it involve?" "Interviews with you, Eleanor, Amanda, and David. Footage of the museum's operations, the educational programs, the conservation work. They want to use our story as an example of how museums can serve as catalysts for community renewal." Marco felt a familiar warmth of pride, not just in their accomplishments, but in the recognition that their work had implications beyond Greystone's borders. "I'll discuss it with the team tomorrow, but I think Eleanor would love the opportunity to share her story with a wider audience." After ending the call, Marco stood on his small balcony, looking out over the town that had become truly home. In the distance, he could see the museum's silhouette against the night sky, its windows dark, but its presence a constant reminder of what could be accomplished when people cared enough to fight for what mattered. 6 months ago, he'd been a man whose life seemed to be defined by lost job, lost marriage, lost relationship with his son. But Eleanor Whitmore's legacy had taught him that apparent endings could actually be beginnings, that broken things often contained the most precious treasures, and that the greatest adventures sometimes began with the smallest act of curiosity. The compass that had guided their investigation now sat in the museum's permanent collection, its needle pointing steadily toward magnetic north. But Marco had learned that the most important compass was the one inside himself, the internal sense of direction that pointed toward purpose, meaning, and connection with others. Tomorrow, David would arrive early to help set up for a special exhibition opening. Amanda would continue her meticulous work, cataloguing and preserving the recovered artifacts. Eleanor would welcome visitors with the gentle enthusiasm of someone who'd spent decades dreaming of this moment. And Marco would stand in the doorway of the main hall, watching wonder unfold on the faces of children encountering history for the first time. The museum's mission statement, written collaboratively by the entire staff, hung framed in the entrance hall. We preserve the past to inspire the future, believing that wonder is the birthright of every generation and that the stories we tell today become the foundation for tomorrow's discoveries. Marco Silva had found his place in that mission, not as the failed teacher he'd once believed himself to be, but as the guardian Eleanor had always known would come. The treasure they'd uncovered wasn't measured in dollars or artifacts, it was measured in the knowledge that some things are worth preserving, some truths are worth fighting for, and some legacies are worth carrying forward no matter the cost. Standing under the stars of a grey stone night, Marco smiled and headed inside to rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to share the magic of discovery with minds eager to learn. The greatest treasure of all wasn't hidden in basement vaults or secret compartments. It was the simple, profound joy of helping others understand that they were part of something larger than themselves, connected to all the generations that had come before and all the ones yet to come.